The Chum bucket sat quietly at the edge of Bikini Bottom. Most nights, it was a lonely place, but tonight it seemed even more hushed than usual. The sign outside swayed just a little, creaking in the faint underwater current, and the dim light above the door flickered like a tired star. Inside, the restaurant was silent except for the soft hum of a few machines. The tables were empty. The chairs sat neatly in place, untouched. The faint scent of metal and seawater lingered in the air. It was not the kind of place most creatures would find comforting, yet for Plankton, this was home. Plankton rested on the wide table in the center of the room. To most, it was just an ordinary table, but to someone as small as him, it stretched out like a great wooden plane. On the surface of the table lay a tiny notebook. Its cover was worn, the edges curled from use. Plankton opened the notebook carefully, using both of his little arms, and flipped through the pages one by one. Each page was filled with scribbles, diagrams, and doodles. To others, it might look like nonsense, but to Plankton, these pages were his world. His plans, his ideas, his dreams. Some of the drawings were sharp and wild, sketches of machines with gears and claws. Others were softer, almost like daydreams, little pictures of things that didn't need to exist, but were nice to imagine. Plankton sighed, his single eye scanning over the marks of his pen. It was late. Too late for work, too late for schemes. The night outside pressed against the windows, dark and endless. The quiet wrapped itself around him, soft and gentle, like a blanket. For once, he wasn't thinking about competition. He wasn't thinking about Krabby Patties or rival restaurants or arguments. Instead, he thought about the way silence made the room feel bigger, calmer. He let his mind wander into softer corners of thought, into dreams that were not about winning, but about resting. He turned to a fresh page in his notebook. The paper was smooth, blank, ready to hold whatever dream came next. He tapped the page lightly with his pen, then let the ink flow in slow, curving lines. This plan wasn't a real plan, not the kind he would ever build. It was more of a fantasy, a bedtime thought, something to fill the quiet. He sketched a tiny machine shaped like a seashell. From its center, he imagined it would release little bubbles that glowed faintly in the dark. Each bubble would drift upward slow and steady until it disappeared into the ceiling. He pictured himself watching those bubbles late at night, letting them rise and vanish, one after another, like counting stars. Plankton smiled faintly at the thought. It wasn't a plan for power or for fame or even for success. It was just a plan for peace. He flipped to the next page. This time his pen traced a small hammock, strung between two coral branches. The hammock swayed gently in his sketch, as if the current itself carried him back and forth. He imagined lying in it, eyes half closed, rocked by the ocean, safe and still. He even drew tiny seashells decorating the hammock's edges, so it would sing faintly whenever the water touched it. Not a song for the world, but a song for himself, a lullaby made of shells and sea. He paused, staring at the drawing until his eye grew heavy. The hum of the machines in the Chum bucket grew softer in his ears like distant waves. He let himself breathe slowly, in and out, in and out. With each breath, the world outside seemed to fade, leaving only him, his notebook, and the quiet. On the next page, he drew something different. A lantern, but not an ordinary lantern. This one would float above his bed, glowing not with fire, but with a soft golden shimmer. It would never burn out, never grow too bright. It would cast just enough light to make the darkness feel gentle, not heavy. He pictured the glow spreading across the chum bucket, making the shadows softer, the corners warmer. As he drew, he realized that all his ideas tonight had something in common. They were not inventions to impress anyone. They were not devices to change the world. They were simply comforts, things to make the night quieter, gentler, safer. And that thought, perhaps, was the quietest plan of all. Plankton leaned back against the notebook, resting his tiny arms at his sides. The paper smelled faintly of ink, and the wooden table carried the coolness of the water around it. Above him, the ceiling lights buzzed faintly, but even that sound seemed softer now. He wondered if maybe, just maybe, the ocean outside felt the same way, wide and still, full of little dreams drifting gently like bubbles. He liked to imagine that somewhere out there even the waves were resting, that the sea itself was asleep, and he was just another dream it carried. And with that thought, Plankton closed his notebook, resting his hand on the cover. He wasn't ready to sleep yet, but he didn't need to plan anymore either. The night itself had become his plan. Plankton rested quietly on the table, the little notebook closed beneath his hand. He could still feel the faint texture of the cover, worn from so many nights of thinking and dreaming. For years, that notebook had been filled with plans of mischief, grand designs to change his place in the world. But tonight, the weight of those ideas felt far away, like a storm that had drifted to another sea. The chum bucket was hushed. The kitchen machine stood silent. The fryer, the mixer, the great steel vats that usually rattled with his schemes, all of them were quiet now, as if the entire building had agreed to join him in rest. It felt strange yet comforting to be surrounded by so much stillness. He turned his gaze toward the window. Through the glass, he could see the dim shimmer of the ocean. The water outside shifted lazily, carrying faint particles of sand and light. Every so often, a small fish would drift past, its scales flashing like stars before vanishing again into the deep. Plankton let his mind wander. What if he planned for the ocean instead of against it? Not machines to conquer, but ideas to soften. He imagined tiny lamps attached to coral branches outside the chum bucket. They would glow in different colors, blues, greens, and gentle yellows, not for attracting customers, but simply to make the night more beautiful. He pictured travelers pausing to rest by those lights, the water around them calm and still. Even if they never stepped inside his restaurant, they would at least feel welcome passing by. He chuckled softly at the thought. It was unlike him, unlike the Plankton everyone thought they knew. But perhaps in the quiet, he could be someone else. Someone who didn't have to fight so hard all the time. Someone who could enjoy small comforts without needing to prove anything. He climbed onto his notebook, using it as a little seat, and leaned against his pen. The pen was tall compared to him, almost like a tower, but its presence was familiar, steady. Closing his eye halfway, he breathed deeply, letting the cool ocean air fill him. The quiet stretched on. It wasn't an empty quiet, though. It was the kind of silence that carried meaning, the kind that felt alive. The hum of the water, the faint buzz of the light bulb, the distant crackle of the ocean floor, all of it blended together into a soft lullaby. He imagined the chum bucket not as a restaurant, but as a sanctuary. The hard metal walls softened by curtains of seaweed. The tables covered not with menus, but with seashells polished smooth and glowing faintly in the dim light. Each chair could be replaced by a soft sponge cushion, something for resting rather than eating. And instead of the clatter of dishes, the room would echo only with gentle waves of calm. Plankton thought about what it would feel like to live in such a place where no one came to compete, where no one asked questions or challenged him, a place where he didn't need to explain himself at all. The thought was strange but soothing. He closed his eye for a moment, imagining the feeling of sinking into such stillness as if the Chum bucket itself had become a cradle. When he opened his eye again, he reached for his notebook and flipped it open once more. He began sketching, slowly, carefully. The lines on the page turned into shapes, soft arches, circles, and flowing waves. He wasn't designing a machine this time. He was sketching a room filled with cushions, lamps, and a wide hammock in the center. The kind of place where the ocean's hush could be felt in every corner. As he drew, his thoughts grew slower, dreamier. Each stroke of the pen was less about precision and more about rhythm. He let the ink trail in loops and swirls, almost as if he were drawing the sound of the water itself. The page became messy, but he didn't mind. It wasn't meant for anyone else. It was just a picture for him, a dream to hold in the quiet of the night. Plankton leaned over the drawing and smiled faintly. His eyes softened, heavy with the weight of stillness. He wondered if dreams like these counted as plans at all, or if they were something gentler, something between plans and wishes. Perhaps they didn't need names. Perhaps they could just exist, floating like bubbles, drifting into the night. The longer he sat, the slower his thoughts became. He imagined himself not in the Chum bucket, but outside, resting on the ocean floor. The sand cool beneath him, the water soft around him, the glow of the moon filtering down in pale silver beams. He pictured lying there with nothing to do, no schemes, no inventions, only breathing, only drifting, only being. And in that vision, the world felt kind. Not loud, not hurried, not demanding. Just kind and calm, and wide enough for even the smallest creature to find peace. Plankton closed his notebook once more. He let his tiny hand rest on the cover, his breathing slow and even. The night had only just begun, but already he felt the pull of rest, like a tide drawing him gently deeper. He whispered softly to himself, though no one else was there to hear. Tonight, the plan is quiet. And with that, he leaned back, letting the silence cradle him, while the sea outside carried his unspoken dreams. The stillness of the Chum bucket lingered like a soft lullaby, stretching through every wall, every corner, every pipe and bolt. Plankton sat quietly, his small body dwarfed by the great table, and listened. The silence was not empty. It was alive with tiny hidden sounds, the faint whir of a forgotten machine, the distant pop of bubbles escaping through cracks, the occasional sigh of the ocean pressing against the glass. For once he let those sounds comfort him. Usually every noise reminded him of unfinished work or broken parts. But tonight he thought of them as music, a slow, simple song played just for him. He shifted closer to the edge of the table and peered down. The floor stretched out far below, smooth and dark. In his mind, he imagined it covered in soft sand instead, like a miniature beach inside his own restaurant. The sand would be cool beneath him, smooth and gentle, the kind that shifted like silk when you pressed into it. He pictured himself walking across it, each step sinking slightly, leaving trails that the current would erase with time. Plankton smiled faintly at the thought. His restaurant had always been built for business, for battles, for blueprints. But what if it could be rebuilt in dreams? Not as a fortress, not as a lab, but as a quiet shore. A place where the world paused, where nothing rushed, where even time itself seemed to stretch out slowly like a yawn. He let his eye drift upward toward the ceiling. The light above buzzed faintly, its glow uneven and thin. But in his imagination, it wasn't a bulb at all. Instead, he pictured a wide skylight opening directly into the ocean above. Through it, he could see the moonlight pouring down, silver ribbons of light weaving into the dark. Tiny schools of fish would pass by, their bodies glittering like constellations. Jellyfish would drift lazily, pulsing like glowing lanterns. And perhaps, if he watched long enough, even a great sea turtle might swim past, slow and timeless, like a guardian of the night. The vision soothed him. He leaned back, letting his body rest against the notebook once again. The table beneath him felt sturdier now, not cold, not metallic, but safe, like the surface of a raft floating on the quiet sea. He thought about his life for a moment. So much of it had been spent on rushing, scheming, proving. Each day filled with grand ideas that always seemed just out of reach. But here, in the softness of the night, none of that mattered. The quiet made him realize that plans didn't always need to succeed to be worth having. Sometimes the act of imagining was enough. The comfort came not from the outcome, but from the gentle dream itself. He picked up his pen again, the tall object almost comical in his tiny hand, and began to draw once more. This time he sketched not a machine or an invention, but something more abstract. Lines that curved like waves, circles like drifting bubbles, long strokes that reminded him of currents, weaving in and out of one another. It wasn't a plan anymore, it was art. And though the shapes made little sense, they calmed him. Each mark of ink was like breathing in and out, in and out. Plankton stared at the page until the shapes blurred, his single eye heavy with drowsiness. He let the pen fall gently to the side, and he curled himself against the spine of the notebook. The paper gave off a faint, familiar scent, a mixture of ink and salt water, worn from years of use. It felt like home. The hum of the ocean outside deepened, or perhaps his mind simply sank further into it. He imagined himself much smaller than he already was, so tiny that the whole table became a great island, the pen a tall tower, and the notebook a mountain at his back. He pictured the table surrounded by waves, each one slow and calm, brushing against the edges like a lullaby. In that dreamlike thought, he was no longer just Plankton. He was a traveler resting on a quiet island, letting the sea carry him where it wished. No battles to fight, no treasures to chase, only the ocean, only the night. He breathed slowly, the rise and fall of his tiny body steady and calm. The notebook beneath him seemed to hum with his heartbeat, and the whole Chum bucket seemed to breathe along with him. The silence grew warmer, softer, wrapping around him like a blanket of seaweed, holding him gently in place. He whispered to himself again, though his voice was almost lost to the stillness. One day, maybe this will be enough. And with that, he closed his eye for a moment, not quite asleep, but drifting, as though the ocean itself were rocking him deeper into dreams. The night outside the Chum bucket deepened, the water pressing gently against the glass like a soft hand. Plankton stirred slightly, shifting on the surface of his notebook, but he did not open his eye right away. He allowed himself a few more moments of drifting between waking and sleeping, the quiet stretching around him like an endless ocean. When he finally blinked his eye open, the room looked different somehow. Nothing had changed, yet the shadows seemed softer, the corners less sharp. Perhaps it was simply the way the darkness had settled in, but it felt as though the chum bucket itself was leaning closer, listening to his quiet thoughts. He sat up slowly, rubbing his little arms together for warmth, though the water around him was steady and calm. His gaze wandered across the empty room. Every table and chair stood silently, waiting for customers who never came. But instead of loneliness, Plankton felt something gentler. It was as if those chairs were not empty, but patiently holding space for dreams yet to arrive. He thought about what it might be like if the chum bucket truly were a place of rest instead of rivalry. What if creatures from the reef came not for food, but for quiet? They could sit together in silence, listening to the hum of the water. Perhaps someone might even close their eyes at a table, using their folded arms as a pillow, while the ocean sang softly outside. It was a thought unlike any plan he had ever drawn before, but tonight it felt just right. He opened his notebook again, carefully flipping to a clean page. This time his pen traced the outline of the chum bucket itself. But instead of steel walls and sharp edges, he softened the lines, turning them into curves and arches. He drew vines of seaweed hanging from the sign, seashells lining the doorframe, and glowing lanterns floating above the entrance like drifting jellyfish. It no longer looked like a restaurant. It looked like a retreat, a safe harbor for anyone who needed stillness. Plankton tilted his head as he studied the drawing. He had never once thought of his building this way. For years, it had been a symbol of ambition, of endless attempts to rise above his rival. But here, on this page, it had transformed into something new, not a fortress, but a home. He closed the notebook once more, pressing his tiny hand against the cover. It was almost as if sealing the page would hold the dream inside, keeping it safe until morning. He breathed deeply, letting the thought sink into him, warming him from within. The hum of the machines had faded now, their energy nearly gone. The silence that remained was even softer, like a whisper. Plankton could imagine that the ocean itself was singing to him, a wordless song that only he could hear. The tune was simple, carried in the rhythm of the currents, in the gentle shift of the tide. He let it wash over him, carrying away the sharper edges of his thoughts. Slowly he crawled toward the edge of the notebook and curled himself up. His small body fit easily into the curve of the spine as though it had been made just for him. He rested his arms beneath his head, his single eye half closed. The table felt enormous beneath him, but it no longer seemed cold or hard. In his mind, it was an island of wood floating on the quiet sea, steady and sure. He let his breathing fall into rhythm with the sounds around him and with the faint buzz of the light, out with the distant whisper of the ocean. Each inhale filled him with calm. Each exhale carried away the last traces of worry. Plankton's thoughts slowed, spreading out like ripples on still water. He pictured himself smaller still, a speck drifting in the vastness of the sea. But instead of fear, the thought brought him peace. He imagined the ocean cradling him gently, holding him close like a mother holds a child. He was not alone. He was part of something wider, something endless, something that did not demand or rush. His eye grew heavier. The shadows around him blended with the light, turning the chum bucket into a blur of shapes. He no longer needed to draw, no longer needed to plan. The night itself was his plan now, a plan of stillness, of silence, of rest. As his breathing deepened, he whispered softly to himself, so quietly that the words barely carried through the water. Tonight, I don't need to be anything more. Tonight, I just need to drift. And with that, Plankton closed his eye fully. The notebook lay beneath him like a pillow, the table like a raft, the ocean like a blanket. The Chum bucket watched over him, not as a place of failure or ambition, but as a cradle in the sea. Slowly, gently, he drifted into sleep. The machine slept. The water slept. Even the moon above seemed to hush itself, dimming to match the quiet of his dreams. The night carried him soft and endless, and for once, Plankton felt at peace. The night in the Chum bucket remained hushed, but Plankton stirred again, awakened not by noise, but by thought. His rest had been light, filled with drifting images, shapes of gears, sparks of light, and gentle machines that did not frighten or harm, but soothed. When his eye blinked open, he realized he was still resting on his notebook, his tiny arm draped lazily across the cover. He sat up slowly, rubbing at his eye. The silence around him felt deeper now, as though the whole building had fallen into an even heavier slumber. It was the perfect kind of quiet for imagining. Plankton loved this time of night, when his thoughts flowed like soft waves, and the world outside seemed far away. He opened his notebook once again, flipping past the sketches of hammocks and glowing lanterns. He turned to a fresh page, the blank paper gleaming faintly under the dim ceiling light. For a moment, he simply stared at it, letting his mind wander before the pen touched the page. Then, with slow, steady movements, he began to draw. This was no ordinary plan. It was not the kind of blueprint he would present with pride, nor one that could ever change his fortunes. It was a gentler idea, born not from ambition, but from the quiet craving for peace. The first gadget he sketched was small, a device shaped like a seashell. In his imagination, it would sit quietly on a table or a shelf. When switched on, it would release glowing bubbles, each one shining softly as it floated upward. The bubbles would drift slowly through the room, lighting the space like tiny lanterns. Some would pop against the ceiling with the faintest sparkle, while others would hover just above his reach, glowing like captured starlight. He imagined sitting in the darkness, surrounded by that glow as though the whole Chum bucket had been filled with stars. The thought made his body relax, a faint warmth spreading through him. Plankton smiled softly and moved to the next page. Here. He drew a second gadget, a current maker. It would not be loud or powerful like the great machines of the surface world. Instead, it would create the gentlest of tides, rocking the room in slow, steady rhythm. The current would sway him back and forth, as though he were lying in a cradle made of water. He pictured himself closing his eye, letting the rhythm carry him into dreams, the water holding him steady like a parent's embrace. No waves to toss him, no storms to shake him, only the slow, endless rocking of the sea. He paused at this thought, setting his pen down for a moment. Closing his eye halfway, he imagined what it would feel like. To rest in that steady current, to surrender to it completely. The idea alone made him feel as though the water around him had already begun to sway, lulling him softly back and forth. When he picked up his pen again, he was smiling faintly. On the third page, he drew perhaps his most fanciful idea yet. A dream projector. It would sit above his bed, casting moving shapes onto the ceiling. But not just any shapes. It would show his fondest memories, his happiest imaginings. Perhaps he would see himself floating through a glowing kelp forest, or sitting beneath a sky of golden bubbles. Maybe he would watch himself drifting alongside gentle sea turtles, their shells glistening like mosaics. The projector would not need commands, for it would know which dreams to show. it would only play the ones that soothed him, the ones that filled him with calm. He chuckled softly to himself as he drew, the sound barely more than a whisper. What an idea, a machine that gave back kindness instead of taking it. Not a weapon, not a tool for stealing or conquering, but a companion made to soothe. The thought gave him pause. All his life he had thought of machines as helpers to his schemes. But here, tonight, he imagined gadgets that did not serve ambition at all. They existed only for rest, only for peace. Plankton sat back, setting down his pen again. The pages in front of him now held glowing bubbles, gentle currents, and a theater of dreams. He looked at them with a strange fondness, as though they were not sketches, but friends. The Chum bucket hummed faintly around him. The lights flickered, the pipes creaked softly, but he no longer noticed. All he saw were the inventions of his imagination, each one softer than the last, each one kinder than the world had ever been to him. He whispered again, his voice low, carried away by the water. These are the plans I like best. And then he laid his tiny hand over the page, as though holding the dream in place. Plankton sat quietly on the table, staring at the sketches he had just made. The seashell bubble maker, the gentle current machine, the dream projector, they seemed to glow on the page, not with ink, but with imagination. He rested his chin against his tiny hands, his single eye soft with thought. For so long, his inventions had been loud, sharp, designed to impress or intimidate. But these felt different. They were small, harmless, even fragile in a way. And yet they seemed stronger than any contraption he had ever built. Stronger because they carried comfort. He flipped to another page. His pen moved slowly, curving into a new design. This time he pictured a music box. Not a clunky, mechanical one, but something shaped like a pearl. Inside, a soft glow would pulse with every note. The sound it played wouldn't be grand or complex, just a simple melody, slow and tender, like a lullaby sung by the ocean itself. He imagined winding it up before closing his eye, and as the tune drifted through the Chum bucket, the water around him would shimmer gently, keeping time with the music. He smiled faintly, already hearing it in his head. A tune that didn't demand attention, that didn't need applause. A song that existed simply to keep him company in the night. On the next page, he began sketching again. His lines were loose, dreamy, as though the gadget was forming by itself. He pictured a little globe filled with swirling water. When touched, the water inside would glow and ripple, casting soft patterns of light across the walls. Not bright, not overwhelming, just enough to make the shadows feel less lonely. He thought of calling it a quiet orb. It would sit beside him, always ready to bathe the room in shifting colors, a reminder that he was never truly alone in the dark. Plankton placed his pen down for a moment, rubbing his arms together thoughtfully. The more he imagined, the more he realized how different these plans were from his usual ones. They weren't about hunger or rivalry, but about filling the spaces between. The quiet hours, the long nights, the moments when no one else was there. He let his gaze wander back to the window. Outside, the ocean was still. The faint glimmer of jellyfish pulsed in the distance, their bodies glowing like lanterns drifting through the water. Plankton's eyes softened. Maybe, he thought, the ocean had always known about gentle gadgets. It already had its own glowing creatures, drifting currents, soft sands that hushed your steps. Perhaps all he was doing was copying the sea, putting its comforts onto paper. He picked up the pen once more. This time, he drew something very small, a tiny pillow no bigger than himself. It wasn't really a gadget, more of a dream. But in his sketch, he imagined it filled with sea foam, soft and buoyant, perfectly shaped for his size. The pillow would glow faintly in the dark, a guiding light in case he woke during the night. It would be his anchor, always there, always safe. The thought brought him an unexpected warmth. Plankton had lived much of his life without comforts made for someone his size. The world was too big, too rough, too sharp. But here, in his notebook, he could create things that were just right. A place, a pillow, a bubble lamp, all scaled to him, all made to hold him gently. He set the pen aside again and stretched his small arms, letting out a tiny sigh. The room felt softer now, as though the gadgets he imagined had already come to life, filling the chum bucket with warmth. He could almost see the bubbles drifting, the orb glowing, the pearl music box singing faintly in the corner. It was a strange trick of the mind to feel comforted by things that didn't exist. But for Plankton, tonight, that was enough. He curled closer to his notebook, letting his body rest against the curve of its spine. The paper beneath him carried the smell of ink and the promise of more dreams. His eye blinked slowly, heavy but not ready to close just yet. He wanted to imagine one more gadget before drifting further into the night. So he opened the book again, flipped to another page, and began to draw. This one was unlike the others. It wasn't a bubble maker, or a projector, or a pillow. It was something simpler, a candle. Of course, the candles didn't burn underwater, but in his dream, this one did. Its flame flickered gently, golden and soft, never fading, never smoking. The flame didn't heat or burn, it simply glowed. He pictured it resting on his table, casting rings of warmth across the room. The kind of light that seemed to whisper, "Everything is safe." Plankton closed his eye for a moment and let the image settle in his mind. A flame that never burned out, a light that never left. A gentle gadget for endless nights. He whispered softly, almost as if promising the dream to himself. "One day, I'll build something like this. Something that doesn't fight, doesn't take, but stays." The candle's golden flame lingered in Plankton's mind long after he had set his pen down. It flickered there in the quiet of the chum bucket, as if it truly existed, a steady light, warm but calm, alive but still. He could almost feel its glow brushing against his tiny frame, wrapping him in the safety. It wasn't the kind of light that made things loud or clear. There was a hush in the form of brightness, a flame that reminded him the night could be trusted. Slowly, his pen moved again. He began sketching beside the candle. This time, he imagined something even smaller, a shell, no bigger than his palm. At first glance, it would look ordinary, but when held close, it would hum softly, a gentle vibration that mimicked the rhythm of waves. Not loud enough to distract, not strong enough to shake, just a faint pulse, steady and calm. It would be a gadget that carried the heartbeat of the ocean. Plankton thought of placing it beneath his pillow, letting the soft thrum lull him as he closed his eye. He paused and touched the page as if the shell could hum already. The thought of it comforted him. He had lived many nights in silence, a silence that felt too wide, too empty. But this shell would give silence shape, filling it with something steady and something that promised he wasn't drifting through the dark alone. Turning the page, he started again. His hand moved slowly, lines forming into another gadget. This one was a lantern, not the kind that glared or demanded attention, but a lantern that breathed. Its light would swell and fade, like the tide itself. The lantern would never burn too brightly. It would glow just enough to remind him of the cycle of breath, the rhythm of calm. He imagined it resting near his bed, its gentle pulse guiding his breathing, steadying his thoughts. Inhale with the light, exhale with the dim. A gadget, not for seeing, but for slowing down. Plankton leaned back and gazed at the sketches. The music pearl, the glowing orb, the tiny pillow, the unburning candle, the humming shell, the breathing lantern. Each one of them seemed to whisper something different, but all of them whispered softly. Not one of them demanded, not one of them shouted. They existed as comforts, as companions. A small chuckle slipped from him. "How strange," he murmured. "All my life I thought inventions had to change the world. But maybe the quietest ones change the world the most." He looked out the window again. The sea was still, but not silent. The faint crackle of sand shifting, the soft hum of currents, the occasional flicker of a fish darting by. The ocean had always been filled with gentle gadgets of its own. Perhaps he was only borrowing what already existed, giving it smaller shapes he could hold. He leaned his elbow on the notebook and let his thoughts drift further. What if these gadgets weren't just for him? What if others could use them too? He imagined SpongeBob holding the glowing orb, eyes wide with wonder as the patterns danced on his walls. He imagined Squidward resting beside the humming shell, his face softening as the vibrations eased his furrowed brow. He imagined even Mr. Krabs letting the breathing lantern guide his thoughts into calmer waters, his worries about money melting into quiet sighs. The picture in Plankton's mind made his chest feel light. These weren't weapons, weren't schemes. They were gifts. Plankton shook his head softly, almost embarrassed at the thought. He wasn't known for giving. But perhaps imagining was enough for tonight. He turned back to his notebook and began one more drawing. This one he shaped carefully, with extra attention to detail. It was a chair. Not an ordinary chair, but one designed for the smallest creature in the sea. It would be cushioned with seaweed, its arms padded with coral, and it would tilt ever so slightly enough to rock him back and forth as though the tide itself carried him. The chair would sigh when sat upon, releasing a faint drift of bubbles that rose slowly, lazily, as though yawning along with him. Plankton stared at the sketch for a long time, his eye glimmering faintly. This was no ordinary gadget. It was something he had always longed for without realizing, a place made just for him. The ocean was vast, and he was small, but here was a seat that fit perfectly. A gadget not to conquer, not to control, but to belong. He let out another sigh, but this one was softer, almost content. It seemed his inventions tonight weren't just gadgets at all. They were answers to feelings he hadn't spoken aloud. Loneliness, restlessness, the desire for comfort, the wish for belonging. Each gadget was a reply, a quiet promise that these feelings could be soothed even if only in dreams. Plankton closed his notebook for a moment and rested his hand upon it. It felt warm, as if the ideas inside had a glow of their own. He whispered gently as though the pages could hear. "Stay with me. Don't vanish when I wake." The notebook sat closed beneath Plankton's small hand, but his mind was still wide open. Even without the pen, new shapes and gentle inventions continued to form behind his eye, each softer than the last. It was as though, once he had let himself imagine comforts, they had begun arriving on their own, flowing in like the tide. He thought of a curtain made of jellyfish silk, thin and shimmering. When drawn across his window, it would filter the light into faint ripples, painting the room in slow-moving waves of silver and blue. The curtain wouldn't shut the world out completely. It would simply soften it, like a lullaby for his eyes. With it, the ocean beyond his window would always appear calm, no matter how wild it truly was. Then came the thought of a book, but not like the notebook before him. This one was different. It wouldn't need words or pictures. Each page, when turned, would release a faint sound, the trickle of a stream, the hum of currents, the distant call of whales. Every flip of a page would bring a new calm. Plankton pictured himself lying beside it, not reading, not learning, simply listening. A book not of stories, but of rest. He let the image drift for a while, then imagined yet another gadget. This one was a companion of sorts, a small sphere that would hover near him, glowing gently, responding to his presence. When he sighed, it would sigh. When he stilled, it would still itself. Not alive, not thinking, but attentive. A reflection, a reminder, a tiny echo of himself in the quiet. Sometimes, he thought, even just the feeling of not being the only one awake made the night softer. Plankton leaned back, folding his arms loosely. He was surprised at how easily these thoughts kept coming, as though some hidden part of him had been waiting for years to dream in this way. His usual plans were heavy, tangled in ambition, filled with deadlines and frustrations. But tonight's inventions were light, floating upward, almost carrying him with them. His gaze moved back to the candle sketch from earlier. The unburning flame, a steady presence in the dark. He imagined setting it beside all his other gadgets, the breathing lantern, the humming shell, the pearl music box, the rocking chair. Together, they formed not a lab, not a workshop, but a sanctuary. A room that glowed, sighed, pulsed, and rocked with quiet comforts. A place that was safe enough, gentle enough, to let him drift without fear. For a long while, Plankton sat in silence, letting the imagined room surround him. He pictured himself stepping inside, the soft light meeting him, the gadgets whispering their calm. He would lower himself into the chair, feel the bubbles rise around him, hear the lull of the music pearl. The lantern would guide his breath. The shell would steady his thoughts. The pillow would glow faintly beneath his head. And above all, the candle's flame would promise, "You are safe here." A small warmth rose in Plankton's chest. It was not victory, not triumph. It was something quieter, something rarer for him, contentment. For once, he wasn't chasing something outside himself. He wasn't trying to outsmart or to win. He was simply imagining, and in imagining, he had found a kind of peace. He opened the notebook again, not to draw, but to look. The pages already filled were enough. Lines of ink, curves of possibility, gentle gadgets that existed only here. He traced a claw gently across the page, careful not to smudge, as though each sketch were too fragile to disturb. His single eye blinked slowly, growing heavier with each pass. The notebook was no longer just a book of plans. It was a cradle for his thoughts, holding them, rocking them, keeping them safe until morning. The machines around the Chum bucket hummed faintly, a background chorus to his quiet dreaming. Usually he resented their noise, their reminders of failed schemes and abandoned projects. But tonight even their hum seemed softer, as if they too had joined his inventions in the art of calm. The whole building seemed to exhale with him, in sync with the lantern's imagined glow. Plankton yawned, a small, squeaky sound that echoed into the empty room. He smiled faintly at it, amused at how tiny even his tiredness sounded. He placed his claw atop the notebook once more and whispered into the quiet, "Stay. Don't go anywhere." He wasn't sure if he meant the notebook, the sketches, or the calm itself. Perhaps all three. And with that, he let his eye linger half-closed. The gentle gadgets still hummed in his imagination, keeping him company, keeping him warm. Even if they never left the page, they had already built something real, a space in his heart where rest was allowed. Slowly, softly, Plankton let the weight of his inventions carry him deeper into the night. Not as plans, not as schemes, but as dreams, dreams of gadgets that asked for nothing, yet gave him everything he needed. And in that dream, the sea outside seemed to glow just a little brighter, as if it, too, approved of his quiet plans. Plankton sat in the hush of his restaurant, his notebook resting beside him. For a long while he had been sketching dreams and gentle gadgets, each one more soothing than the last. But as his pen grew still and the pages filled, his thoughts began to drift beyond the walls of the Chum bucket. The ocean outside called to him not with urgency, not with noise, but with a steady, patient rhythm, like a lullaby he had nearly forgotten. He slid down from the table and padded toward the heavy door. The floor was cool beneath his tiny steps, humming faintly with the sound of machinery that never truly rested. But he wanted a quieter sound now, the kind that only the sea could give. When he pushed the door open, a soft current swept in, carrying the calm of the night with it. Outside, the world was vast and hushed. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction, dark, yet not empty. Soft glimmers dotted the water, the glow of distant jellyfish drifting like lanterns in the deep. Sand shimmered faintly below, catching the moonlight that filtered down through the surface above. Plankton paused in the doorway, his single eye widening a little. He had lived in this ocean all his life, and yet nights like these always caught him by surprise. Nights when the sea seemed less like water and more like a sky beneath a sky, holding its own stars and its own moonlight. The currents whispered through the coral nearby, bending it gently back and forth as if the ocean were breathing slowly in its sleep. Plankton stepped outside fully, letting the door close behind him. The sound of the Chum bucket's machines faded, replaced by the hush of the sea. For a moment, he simply stood there, letting it wash over him. The quiet was not empty, it was full of soft motions, tiny flickers, distant hums. It was the kind of quiet that cradled rather than pressed. He tilted his gaze upward. Above, the surface shimmered faintly. The moon was high tonight, and though it could not shine through clearly, its light still danced on the water, breaking into ripples that drifted down like silver threads. Each ripple moved gently, never hurrying, never breaking. Plankton found himself breathing slower, as though his own body wanted to match the rhythm. As he wandered further from the door, he passed a patch of sand where small shells rested in these scattered patterns. Each one caught the moonlight in its own way, glowing like tiny lamps left behind by the sea. He paused to run a claw gently over one, feeling its smooth surface. It was cool to the touch, but not unfriendly. The shells seemed to hum faintly beneath his claw, though he knew it was only the echo of the sea's constant motion. In the distance, a group of jellyfish drifted lazily. Their bodies pulsed in slow, glowing patterns, rising and falling as though rocking in some grand cradle. Plankton watched them for a while, his eyes soft. Their glow was never harsh, never blinding. It was the kind of light that seemed to know the night was meant for rest. He thought back to his sketches, the lantern, the orb, the candle. Perhaps the ocean had already invented them long ago. Perhaps he had only been copying what it had shown him. A small current brushed against him, tugging gently at his tiny body. He let it carry him a little, drifting across the sand. It wasn't strong, just enough to remind him that the ocean never truly stopped moving. Every current was a lull, a rocking, an endless rhythm. He imagined it as a kind hand guiding him, carrying him towards something softer still. As he drifted, he noticed how the sea creatures around him moved differently at night. The fish that darted quickly during the day now swam slower, their fins stirring the water in lazy arcs. The crabs that scuttled busily across the sand now paused often, tucking themselves into their shells, content to rest. Even the seaweed swayed more slowly, its leaves bending with a kind of sleepy grace. The whole ocean seemed to sigh together, united in its drowsiness. Plankton breathed out, a soft sound swallowed by the sea. For once he didn't feel small. Or rather he did, but not in a way that troubled him. The vastness around him didn't press on him tonight. Instead it welcomed him, a tiny creature among many, part of a lullaby bigger than himself. He wasn't alone in the quiet. He was folded into it like a note in a song that went on without end. He settled himself upon a small rock near the sand. It was smooth and cool, just the right size for him to perch upon. From here, he could see the wide stretch of water, the glow of jellyfish, the shimmer of shells. The Chum bucket loomed faintly behind him, its sharp lines softened by the night. But he didn't look back. His gaze stayed on the ocean, on the world that was not built by his claws or machines, but by something older, something eternal. He let the sight soak into him the way light soaks into sand. Every movement of the water, every flicker of distant glow seemed to whisper the same promise. You are safe, you are small, you belong. And for the first time in a long while, Plankton believed it. Plankton sat quietly on the smooth rock, his claws resting in his lap, his single eye gazing out into the open sea. The longer he watched, the more he noticed. The ocean never stopped moving, but its movements tonight were slow, deliberate, as though the whole world had decided to exhale together. A trail of bubbles rose lazily from the sand nearby. Tiny pockets of air, freed from the seabed, drifted upward with no rush. Each one caught the moonlight as it ascended, glowing briefly before vanishing at the surface. Plankton followed them with his gaze until they disappeared, his breathing slowing to match their rise. He wondered how long they had been waiting in the sand before slipping free. Perhaps even bubbles had their own quiet plans, their own timing for release. The sound of the sea was everywhere, but it was not noise. It was layers of softness. The distant rush of a current. The faint clicking of a crab moving somewhere beneath the sand. The creak of a piece of coral swaying back and forth. Each sound was subtle on its own, but together they wove a blanket of calm. Plankton let the sounds wrap around him, letting them fill the spaces where his thoughts usually clattered too loudly. His gaze shifted to a cluster of seaweed swaying nearby. Their long leaves bent gently in the current, brushing against each other in slow arcs. In the daytime, the seaweed often looked tangled, messy, full of darting fish weaving through. But at night they moved like dancers, gliding without effort, each leaf keeping time with the unseen music of the tide. Plankton tilted his head, imagining them as guardians of the night, their soft movements keeping the ocean's rhythm steady. Farther out, the jellyfish continued their slow drift. They glowed in soft pulses like lanterns carried by invisible hands. Plankton imagined them as messengers delivering light from one part of the sea to another. Not hurried, not worried, just patient carriers of quiet. He thought of his own inventions again, the lantern and the candle, and realized the jellyfish had perfected it long ago. They needed no machine, no design. Their light was simply part of who they were, and it was enough. A small fish darted past him suddenly, then slowed, circling in lazy loops as though realizing the night was not meant for rushing. Its scales shimmered faintly, catching what little light the water held. Plankton watched it curiously. The fish had no plan, no destination. It seemed content just to move for the sake of moving, to exist within the calm. He envied that. His whole life had been a string of plans, loud, heavy, endless. But this fish reminded him that sometimes existing was enough. He leaned back slightly against the rock, his body relaxing in small increments. The water pressed gently against him, neither pushing nor pulling, just holding. It reminded him of a cradle, a vast one, built not for him alone, but for every creature of the sea. He thought of how many lives drifted in these waters, each one small, each one carried by the same tide. For once, instead of feeling lost in the enormity, he felt comforted. The ocean was wide, yes, but it was wide enough to hold him too. A flicker above caught his attention. The surface rippled as a faint shadow passed, perhaps a boat, perhaps a cloud sliding across the moon. The light shifted slightly, scattering into new patterns on the sand. Plankton followed the ripples with his gaze, fascinated by how they transformed the seafloor into moving art. Every stone, every shell seemed to glow and fade in turn, as if the sea itself was painting with silver. He thought of how no two patterns would ever be the same. Each moment of light was unique, then gone, replaced by another. The thought felt strangely reassuring. It meant the ocean was always changing, but always beautiful. A gentle current brushed past again, cooler this time. It carried with it the faint scent of salt, and something sweet, perhaps, the bloom of distant sea flowers. Plankton inhaled deeply, letting the faint trace settle into him. The scent mingled with the sounds, with the sights, until the whole night became one woven memory. Not sharp, not overwhelming, but layered, like the pages of his notebook filled with gentle sketches. He sat there for a long time, simply breathing, simply watching. The ocean didn't ask anything of him. It didn't demand a plan, didn't require a scheme. It welcomed him exactly as he was, small, thoughtful, drifting. In its quiet vastness, he felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel: peace. Plankton shifted slightly on the smooth rock, then pushed himself off with a gentle kick of his tiny legs. The current welcomed him, carrying him slowly forward. He wasn't rushing anywhere, and only letting the sea decide his path for him. For once, he wasn't in control, and instead of the usual frustration, there was only relief. It felt almost like floating in a dream. As he drifted, the ocean widened in front of him, revealing pockets of life he might have overlooked in the daylight. A patch of coral stretched upward, glowing faintly in pastel colors. The tiny polyps extended their delicate arms, swaying like they were reaching for something just out of reach. Plankton drew closer, careful not to disturb them. Their quiet persistence struck him. Each polyp was small, fragile-looking, yet together they formed a structure that had lasted years, maybe decades. Strength and softness, it was something he had rarely considered. Between the coral branches, a small seahorse floated. Its body curved gracefully as it clung to a strand of seagrass with its tail. The seahorse didn't dart or chase. It simply hovered, turning gently with the water, patient and still. Plankton watched it, mesmerized by its quiet patience. In his own life, he had always tried to seize, to grasp, to demand. But here was a creature thriving by waiting, by being part of the tide rather than fighting against it. The thought sank into him like a pebble, falling slowly to the seafloor. A school of silvery fish shimmered in the distance. They moved together as though one body, their scales flashing in unison with each turn. The sound of their movement was soft, a faint whisper of fins slicing through water. Plankton followed their dance with his eye. It seemed choreographed, but he knew it wasn't. It was instinct, connection. Each fish trusted the others. Each one moved because the group moved, and together they became something beautiful. He thought of how different that was from his usual life, always alone in his plans, always distrustful. He wondered what it would feel like to move with others, not against them. A patch of sand below caught his attention. At first it looked empty, but then it shifted slightly, and he realized a stingray had been resting there, almost invisible. Its body blended perfectly with the ground, its slow breathing the only sign of life. Plankton hovered above it carefully, watching as it stirred. The stingray's wings lifted, gliding upward with astonishing grace for something so large. It moved with no hurry, its form cutting through the water like a sigh. Plankton felt the current from its passing brush against him, cool and strong, and for a moment he closed his eye, imagining himself moving with that same effortless calm. The ocean darkened as he drifted farther, but the darkness was not frightening. It was gentle, filled with small sparks of life. Tiny plankton cousins of his, in a way, glowed faintly all around like scattered stars drifting in the water. Each one blinked softly, then faded, then glowed again, forming constellations that shifted with the current. Plankton raised a claw toward them, imagining he could trace shapes between their faint lights. He thought of stories he could write in their patterns, stories not of grand conquests or victories, but of calm nights, like this one. Perhaps, he thought, the ocean was telling him a story right now, and all he needed to do was listen. The seafloor below sloped gently, leading toward a wide-open plain of sand. Here the water felt broader, less crowded with coral or seaweed. The emptiness was soothing, like a page waiting to be written on. Small crabs scuttled across the sand, leaving thin trails behind them. Their paths curved and twisted, crisscrossing with one another. Plankton smiled faintly. It was like watching the first drafts of plans being scribbled, each line leading somewhere unknown. And yet the crabs seemed perfectly content, unbothered by where their trails ended. They just walked, explored, and left their marks behind. Above, the moonlight reached down in beams that shimmered through the water. The beams shifted with every ripple, forming columns of silver light that looked like gates leading upward. Plankton floated into one of them, bathing in its glow. The light wrapped around him, soft and cool, as if the sea itself wanted to remind him he wasn't alone. He tilted his face upward, letting the beam wash across his eye. For once, he didn't think about what was above, not the surface, not the boats, not the world he could never reach. He only thought about how peaceful it felt to be caught between the sea and the stars, small but held. In the stillness, his mind began to quiet further. The usual chatter of inventions and plans softened until it was little more than a murmur. Instead, he thought of breaths of bubbles rising, of jellyfish pulsing, of the tide itself inhaling and exhaling. Everything around him moved in cycles of calm, and he was part of that rhythm now. He realized he didn't need to chase it. He only needed to let it carry him, the way the current carried every creature here tonight. Plankton floated there for a long time, listening, watching, letting himself dissolve into the ocean's endless lullaby. Plankton continued to drift across the quiet plain of sand, carried gently by the current. The silence here was deeper, thicker, as though the ocean itself was holding its breath. Every sound seemed slowed the faint click of a distant shell, the whisper of sand shifting under a crab's legs, the soft hum of water gliding past. Even his own movements felt muted, his tiny kicks absorbed by the sea's vastness. He found himself floating toward a small outcrop of stone. It rose from the sand like an island within the ocean, covered in patches of moss and coral. At its top sat a cluster of sea anemones, their soft tentacles swaying gently. They glowed faintly under the moonlight filtering from above, their movements slow and patient, as though each wave of the tide was a lullaby sung only for them. Plankton settled near the base of the outcrop, watching. The anemones didn't fight the water. They yielded, bent, and then returned again and again. There was strength in that surrender. It struck him as something he had rarely allowed himself, the courage to bend instead of resist. A soft shimmer caught his eye nearby. Tiny shrimp, translucent and nearly invisible, drifted through the water. They pulsed in small bursts, their bodies catching fragments of light like glass beads. Plankton followed them with his gaze, feeling as though they were guiding him somewhere deeper, into the very heart of the sea's quiet. So he let them lead. He floated behind them unhurried as they weaved slowly between coral and stone. The water grew cooler here, the current gentler still. It felt like stepping into a secret chamber, a place not often disturbed. Above, the beams of moonlight thinned, but in their place came the glow of bioluminescent life. Tiny specks lit the water around him, pulsing in patterns, some steady, some flickering in the breeze. Plankton drifted among them, his eye wide, reflecting their light. It was as though he had stumbled into an underwater sky, stars scattered not above, but all around. He thought of how often he had looked upward, dreaming of something beyond his reach. He had always believed the answers lay outside in secret formulas, in grand inventions, in victories over rivals. But here, in this quiet chamber of the ocean, he realized that the stars he sought had always been closer than he thought. The sea itself had held them, hidden in the dark, waiting for those who slowed down long enough to see. A soft stirring at the edge of the sand drew his attention. A turtle, ancient and steady, glided into view. Its shell was worn with age, its movements slow but sure. It did not hurry, did not strain. It simply moved, carried by the same current that now carried him. Plankton watched in awe as the turtle passed, its silhouette outlined by the glowing specks around it. It seemed less like a creature and more like a living vessel of time, carrying with it centuries of calm. He wondered what the turtle had seen, what quiet plans it had carried in its long life. Perhaps it had never needed plans at all. Perhaps drifting had always been enough. Plankton exhaled softly, realizing how tight his chest had been, even here. He let that breath go, watching it rise in a trail of tiny bubbles. Each bubble sparkled as it ascended, joining the unseen tide above. He thought of how even something as small as his breath could leave a mark, however brief, on the wide sea. It was not about being grand or lasting forever. It was about existing, glowing, however faintly, in the dark. He closed his eye for a moment, letting the water cradle him. The current rocked him gently, the glow of the tiny lights flickering behind his eyelid. His mind no longer buzzed with schemes or blueprints. Instead, he thought of small things. The jellyfish lanterns he had seen earlier. The patient seahorse wrapped around its grass. The fish that swam without purpose, simply because it could. Each memory softened him further, as though the sea itself was rewriting his thoughts. When he opened his eye again, the turtle was gone, but its calm lingered. The glowing specks still pulsed around him, steady as a heartbeat. The ocean seemed to whisper, though no words were spoken. He felt in that silence a kind of answer. Not the kind he had always chased, and not a formula or a secret or a key, but something simpler, that it was enough to rest, to drift, to be part of something wider than himself. He let himself sink a little deeper, closer to the sand, and curled into a comfortable place near the outcrop of stone. The water wrapped around him like a blanket, the glow of the sea's quiet stars flickering above. He closed his eye once more, and this time there was no tightness, no restlessness. Only the steady rhythm of the tide, moving through him as it moved through everything. For the first time in a long while, Plankton's plans grew quiet. And in that quiet, he felt safe. He felt home. The night ocean had quieted Plankton's restless mind. As he lay curled against the smooth stone, lulled by the steady rhythm of the current, his thoughts began to drift into softer places. The ocean had shown him calm, but now his imagination began to ask, what if calm could be shared? What if he wasn't always alone in his schemes and scribbles? For as long as he could remember, his plans had been solitary. He would mutter to himself, sketch blueprints on scraps of paper, argue with Karen when she disagreed, and then set out alone. There had never been a companion beside him who truly believed in his ideas. But in the quiet now, with the glow of the sea's gentle stars surrounding him, he allowed himself a rare indulgence, to imagine friendship. Not the kind that came with conditions or arguments, but the kind that was soft, patient, and kind. He closed his eye, and in the darkness behind it, pictures began to form. He saw himself not in the chum bucket, not hunched over blueprints, but walking slowly along a sandy path beside someone else. Who was it? He couldn't see clearly. The shape shifted, but he knew it was a friend. Their steps matched his, not rushed, not hurried, just together. The sound of their voices blended with the sea breeze, easy and calm. For once there was no scheming in his words, only laughter, small and genuine. The picture deepened. He imagined sitting with his friend on the edge of a coral reef, their legs dangling into the water. He showed them one of his inventions, not a weapon, not a trap, but a little glowing lantern he had once sketched. In his fantasy, the friend leaned in, their face bright with wonder, not suspicion. They didn't ask what it was for or how it would help him win against crabs. They only said, "It's beautiful." That simple word warmed him in a way victory never had. In the fantasy, he and his friend set the lantern adrift. It floated upward, bobbing gently until it joined the jellyfish that glowed in the distance. Together, they watched it fade into the night. There was no hurry to chase it, no need to cling. Just the quiet joy of sharing something small and lovely. The scene shifted again. Now he pictured himself at a table inside the chum bucket, but it looked different. The lights were softer, the air warmer. Instead of empty chairs and silence, the table was set with simple plates of food. His friend sat across from him, smiling faintly, not judging the food, not mocking. They ate together slowly, talking about nothing in particular, the shape of clouds, the way the tide moved, the funny noises sea snails made at night. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but to Plankton, it felt like treasure. The kind of treasure he had never thought to plan for. He opened his eye briefly, gazing at the glowing specks of bioluminescent plankton floating nearby. They flickered like companions, each one moving on its own, yet together forming a soft constellation. For a moment, he let himself imagine they were his friends gathering around him, listening to his stories, waiting for his inventions to come alive. Even if they were only specks of light, the thought eased the sharp edge of his loneliness. Closing his eye again, his fantasy grew richer. This time he imagined walking into jellyfish fields with his friend. The grass swayed in the current, and the jellyfish pulsed gently overhead. He wasn't there to trap them or study them. He was there simply to wander. His friend pointed out shapes in the clouds above, laughing softly at their own ideas. Plankton laughed too, not the sharp, triumphant laugh of his schemes, but a quieter one, rounder, softer. He realized he had never heard himself laugh like that, but in the fantasy, it came easily. They lay back on the grass, side by side, watching the jellyfish drift past like floating stars. The silence wasn't heavy. It was comfortable, a blanket stretched between them. Plankton's claws rested quietly at his sides, his thoughts no longer rushing to build or to conquer. Instead, they lingered on the simple truth of not being alone. In the dream, his friend turned to him and asked, "What's your next idea?" Not with suspicion, not with impatience, but with curiosity. Plankton smiled shyly, almost embarrassed, as though the idea mattered less than the fact someone wanted to hear it. He told them about a new kind of bubble machine, one that made bubbles in the shapes of stars. His friend's eyes lit up, and they said, "Let's build it together." That simple word "together" echoed through the fantasy like music. It was what he had never had. And now, in the softness of the ocean night, in the cradle of calm, it was what he allowed himself to imagine. Plankton sighed contentedly, the fantasy wrapping around him like a quilt. For once, his plans weren't about conquest. They were about companionship. And that thought made the ocean feel even wider, even kinder. The fantasy unfolded like the pages of a storybook, each scene gentler than the last. Plankton, still nestled near the glowing outcrop of stone, let his mind wander further. This time, the blurred shape beside him in his dream sharpened into someone familiar. It was SpongeBob. The thought might have made him laugh in the daylight or sneer with irritation. But here, in the hush of the ocean night, it felt natural. SpongeBob had always been full of energy, always running, laughing, working at the Krusty Krab. And yet, Plankton realized, SpongeBob also had something he had never known how to find. Joy in the smallest things. What would it be like to share that? In the fantasy, SpongeBob greeted him with the same boundless cheer he offered everyone. "Hi, Plankton," he said, waving brightly, as if there were no history of failed schemes or rivalries between them. Plankton hesitated, waiting for mockery, but it never came. Instead, SpongeBob held out a hand. Not to fight, not to push him away, but to invite him along. They walked together across the sandy ocean floor, SpongeBob humming tunelessly, Plankton listening with a cautious curiosity. For once, Plankton wasn't plotting how to use him or how to trick him. He was just walking beside someone who didn't mind his company. It was disarming and oddly soothing. In the fantasy, SpongeBob took him to a meadow of sea flowers. Their petals swayed with the current, releasing faint trails of glowing pollen. Plankton had passed them many times before, never giving them more than a glance. But SpongeBob bent down, marveling at the smallest details, how the petals folded when touched, how the pollen sparkled as it drifted away. He pointed excitedly as though discovering treasure. And Plankton, against his usual instincts, found himself smiling. It wasn't the flowers that mattered. It was the way someone else cared enough to notice them with him. The fantasy shifted again, and now the two of them sat on a rock ledge overlooking the wide reef. SpongeBob pulled out a simple bubble wand and blew a stream of bubbles into the water. They rose in soft clusters, catching the light as they drifted upward. He laughed, clapping his hands at the way they shimmered. Then, to Plankton's surprise, SpongeBob handed him the wand. Plankton hesitated, embarrassed at first, but then dipped it into the soap and blew. The bubbles floated out in small, wobbly shapes, not as large or perfect as SpongeBob's. But SpongeBob clapped just as joyfully. "Those are amazing, Plankton," he said with complete sincerity. And in that dreamlike moment, Plankton realized how rarely anyone had praised him without condition. The warmth of it lingered, even as the bubbles drifted away. But SpongeBob wasn't the only face in his fantasies. As the dream deepened, another figure appeared, Sandy Cheeks. He imagined her not in her usual scientist helmet, but sitting comfortably under a dome of glowing coral. She spoke to him in her calm, steady drawl, asking about his inventions, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. She didn't scoff when he described an idea too big for his tiny body to build. Instead, she tilted her head thoughtfully and said, "That's clever, Plankton. You got a sharp mind." The words, even in imagination, warmed him more than any stolen secret ever had. He pictured Sandy sketching alongside him, her large hands steady, filling in the lines his small claws couldn't manage. Together they built not a weapon, not a trap, but a gentle machine, a device that scattered glowing dust across the water like starlight. They released it together, watching the particles drift, turning the ocean to a galaxy. In his fantasy, Sandy laughed softly, proud of their work. Plankton felt pride too, but not the sharp, lonely pride of victory. It was the round, full pride of sharing. The scene softened again, blurring into another vision. Now he saw himself at a small gathering. SpongeBob, Sandy, maybe even Patrick sitting nearby. They weren't enemies. They weren't rivals. They were simply companions. The group sat in a circle on the sand, each one telling stories, their voices weaving together like threads. Plankton imagined himself speaking, his voice timid at first. But instead of rolling their eyes or laughing at him, the others leaned closer, listening with care. The simple act of being heard filled him with a warmth he hadn't known he'd been missing. He opened his eye briefly, looking once more at the tiny glowing specks around him in the real ocean. They pulsed gently, like small friends keeping him company. And he realized something. Maybe friendship didn't have to be as grand as his fantasies. Maybe it could begin with small things, a kind word, a shared laugh, a moment of patience. Even if he had never had it before, he could still imagine it. And sometimes imagination was enough to soften the edges of loneliness. He closed his eye again, sinking back into the fantasy, letting it build even richer worlds of companionship. In the dreamscape of his thoughts, Plankton let the grand scenes fade into something smaller, quieter. It wasn't the fireworks of invention or the spectacle of glowing oceans he longed for most. It was the simple, everyday companionship that had always been missing from his life. He imagined waking up one morning not to the metallic hum of empty machinery in the Chum bucket, but to the sound of someone calling his name softly. A friend. Perhaps SpongeBob's cheery voice or Sandy's calm greeting. He pictured himself stepping outside into the soft glow of early daylight, not rushing to prepare a scheme, but walking beside someone, ready to face the day together. There was no weight of conquest in this vision, no urgency. Only the feeling that he belonged somewhere, with someone. The fantasy shifted to a kitchen table. It was small, a little uneven, but warm. Plankton sat across from a friend, a simple cup before him. Not a potion or experiment, just tea. Steam rose from it in soft curls. They drank together in silence at first, the quiet, comfortable, not heavy. Every now and then the friend would smile or hum, filling the air with a presence that made the silence rich instead of empty. Plankton thought of how different that was from his usual mornings filled with muttering, frustration, and the hum of lonely machines. Here, even silence was a kind of company. He imagined walking to the park with a group of friends. The fields of jellyfish glowed faintly under the sun, the grass swaying with the tide. Patrick stumbled over his own feet, laughing. Sandy carried a book under her arm. SpongeBob pointed out shapes in the clouds, each more ridiculous than the last. Plankton, so small compared to them all, wasn't left behind. Instead, someone always slowed to match his pace. A hand reached down now and then, not to pick him up against his will, but to offer him a lift when he grew tired. He accepted, not out of weakness, but because it felt good to be cared for. Later in the fantasy, he pictured himself sitting in SpongeBob's living room. The walls glowed with the soft light of a crackling snail lamp, and Gary purred faintly nearby. They played a simple game on the table, not strategy, not competition, but something playful, something that made everyone laugh. Patrick laughed so hard he fell over. Sandy chuckled behind her paw. Even Squidward, sitting reluctantly in the corner, cracked a small, unwilling smile. And Plankton laughed too, a laugh so warm and free it surprised even him. It wasn't the sharp bark of triumph he was used to, but a rounder, softer sound. It echoed in the dream like music. The fantasy deepened, carrying him into evening. He saw himself at the edge of Goo Lagoon, sitting with his friends as the sun sank in slow waves of color. The water shimmered with oranges and purples, the horizon stretching endlessly. Beside him, his companions leaned back, content, saying little. The comfort was not in words, but in presence. No one hurried away. No one left him behind. They stayed, watching the colors fade together. It was enough. Plankton let himself sink further into the vision, imagining even smaller details, the way someone might hand him a seashell they thought looked pretty, just because they wanted him to have it. The way laughter sounded when it wasn't directed at him, but shared with him. The way someone might listen to his quiet ramblings about an invention, not to mock, but to encourage. He realized with a sudden tenderness that these were the things he had been craving all along. Not grand victories, not power, not secrets, just the soft weight of belonging. The dream grew stiller, as if the ocean itself wanted to cradle these thoughts. Plankton pictured himself returning home at the end of a long day, his friend walking with him. The Chum bucket didn't feel cold and empty in this vision. It felt alive, warmed by laughter and soft voices. The machines hummed gently in the background, not as tools of conquest, but as instruments of creativity. On the table sat small sketches, not of traps or weapons, but of toys, lanterns, simple inventions that brought joy instead of trouble. And beside those sketches lay another claw, steadying his as they drew together. He imagined falling asleep with the faint hum of conversation still in the air, knowing that when he woke, he would not be alone. It was a thought so foreign and so gentle that his chest ached with it. An ache not of pain, but of longing softened by possibility. In the fantasy, as sleep came, he felt a hand rest lightly on his back. Not heavy, not demanding, just a reminder. A reminder that he was not forgotten, that he mattered, that he was, at last, a friend. The thought lingered like a lullaby as he floated in the real ocean, his tiny body rocked gently by the current. The line between dream and water blurred, and for a moment it didn't matter which was which. He was carried, and he was not alone. As Plankton's dream drifted further, he began to notice how friendship didn't need to be loud or dazzling. It didn't need parades, fireworks, or triumphs. Sometimes it was as quiet as a shadow falling beside your own, proof that someone was walking with you. Sometimes it was as simple as hearing your name called, not in frustration, not in anger, but with warmth. In this vision, he imagined SpongeBob passing by the Chum bucket one afternoon. There was no scheme, no confrontation, just a wave that lingered long enough to say, "I see you. You matter." It was such a small thing, but in Plankton's mind it bloomed larger than any plan of conquest ever had. For the first time, he wasn't invisible. He was part of something greater than his own ambition. The dream took him through an ordinary day, painted with extraordinary gentleness. He saw himself sitting with Sandy beneath the dome of her tree dome. She explained one of her experiments, her voice calm and patient, not rushing over his questions, not dismissing him as too small or too troublesome. She listened when he spoke, nodding as though his thoughts mattered. Plankton realized that real friendship wasn't about always being right or always being strong. It was about being heard. He then imagined Patrick. In the dream, Patrick wasn't clever, but he was endlessly kind. Patrick offered him a jellyfish net, saying they could share it. The net was far too big for Plankton, of course, but Patrick bent down and helped guide his claw. They moved together slowly, laughing when they missed, cheering when they almost caught one. Plankton thought how rare it was to have someone who didn't measure his worth in success, but in the joy of simply trying. Then Squidward appeared, distant as always. At first, Plankton thought the vision might sour that Squidward would roll his eyes or send him away. But in this dream, even Squidward softened. He didn't invite Plankton to join his music practice, but he didn't stop him from listening either. Plankton sat in the corner of Squidward's living room, watching the clarinet rise and fall, the notes filling the space with a melancholy beauty. For once, he wasn't an intruder. He was an audience, and that was enough. The fantasy shifted again, carrying Plankton into the heart of SpongeBob's home, where a group of friends gathered for nothing more than the joy of being together. There was food on the table, laughter in the air, and no schemes, no secrets, no lines drawn between Chum and Krabby Patties. Plankton was simply there. He wasn't a villain, wasn't a nuisance. He was Plankton small, but present, welcome, seen. He looked around the room in this vision. SpongeBob laughed until his sides ached. Patrick clapped his hands. Sandy smiled. Squidward rolled his eyes, but didn't leave. And in the middle of them all, Plankton sat quietly, a part of the circle. He felt the warmth of belonging wrap around him like a blanket, soft and undeniable. The thought alone made his chest ache with something bittersweet. The dream slowed as if savoring its own tenderness. Plankton found himself at the ocean's edge once more. But this time he wasn't alone. His friends sat with him, their voices low, the tide gentle. The stars overhead shimmered with soft light, mirrored by the calm water below. He leaned back, his small frame barely making an impression on the sand. But he wasn't swallowed by emptiness. He was cushioned by presence. He imagined SpongeBob turning toward him, smiling the kind of smile that didn't need words. Just a simple truth. I'm glad you're here. Plankton in the dream didn't know what to say. He only nodded, the weight of longing finally eased by something purer than any victory he had ever sought. The scene faded softer and softer until it was nothing more than the sound of the tide and the glow of starlight. Plankton felt the dream cradle him gently like a hammock of water. No loneliness, no emptiness, just quiet companionship. And as the fantasy closed, he carried with him a new thought, perhaps the boldest plan he had ever dreamed. Not to steal, not to conquer, but simply to belong. It was a plan without blueprints, without machines, without schemes. And yet it was the most intricate, most daring, most precious plan of all. A plan born not of hunger, but of hope. A quiet hope that maybe one day the fantasy might brush against reality, if only for a moment. Until then, the dream remained, swaying gently like the ocean current. And Plankton, tiny and tired, let himself drift fully into the softest sleep, with friendship imagined, yet deeply felt carrying him through the night. The Chum bucket was quiet. So quiet that Plankton could hear the faint ticking of a single drop of condensation falling from one pipe to another. The machines that usually clattered and hummed in restless activity were powered down, their lights dimmed to soft glows. Even Karen's screen, which so often flickered with calculations or sarcastic remarks, had settled into a muted, bluish light that resembled the glow of a night lamp. Plankton floated in the stillness, perched near the top of his favorite stool. The world outside was wrapped in darkness, the deep ocean holding its breath. It was the kind of night where the water itself seemed heavy with calm, as though even the tides were asleep. For once, he wasn't thinking of secret formulas or rivalries. He wasn't sketching out blueprints or muttering to himself about elaborate plans. Instead, he let his mind slow to the rhythm of the ocean. It was an unfamiliar rhythm to him, soft, steady, patient. But the more he listened, the more he realized it had always been there, waiting for him to notice. He imagined the sound of the waves against the shore, not crashing, but gently folding over themselves. Each crest curved like a blanket being drawn up, each retreat like a sigh of release. The ocean, in its endlessness, was drifting into its own dream, and Plankton was being carried along with it. As he out in the quiet, his eyelids heavy, he thought about how strange it was to simply rest. He was so used to chasing, striving, scheming, always moving toward something just out of reach. But now, in this soft darkness, there was nothing to chase. No prize, no victory, only the comfort of stillness. It reminded him of the stories he had once overheard parents telling their children in the shallows. Bedtime tales whispered, not to excite, but to calm. He remembered a mother seahorse telling her young that the stars in the sky were just lanterns left by ancient sailors, guiding lost dreams safely home. Plankton even then had listened from the shadows. He hadn't understood the comfort of such stories back then, but tonight he felt their echo. He let himself imagine the stars above the ocean, even though he was far below the surface. He pictured them flickering softly, not as unreachable fires, but as gentle markers of peace. Each star was a reminder that the universe, vast as it was, had room for even the smallest speck of life, even for him. His mind began to weave dreams of its own, not sharp or detailed like his inventions, but loose and flowing. He saw himself drifting on a current that cradled him like a hammock, carrying him without effort. The water was warm, shimmering with faint light, and above him floated shapes that were neither clouds nor jellyfish, but something in between, soft, glowing, endlessly slow. They drifted as he drifted, companions in quietness. Occasionally, he thought he saw shadows of friends in the dream. SpongeBob's laugh echoed far away, muted into a soothing hum. Patrick's sleepy voice called his name gently, stretching the syllables as though underwater. Even Squidward's clarinet, usually sharp, became part of the lull, the notes slower, deeper, softened by distance. Plankton didn't reach for them. He simply let them float near, content to know that in this dream he wasn't alone. Back in the Chum bucket, his tiny body grew heavier, his antennae drooping. He closed his eyes, and the line between real stillness and imagined stillness dissolved. He could no longer tell whether the hum in his ears was the sound of sleeping machines or the lull of the sea itself. And maybe it didn't matter. For once, he didn't feel the need to separate the two. He could let dream and reality overlap like waves, blending in soft layers. Because tonight, he wasn't searching for something missing. Tonight, he was exactly where he needed to be. The quiet deepened around him, stretching wider and softer, like a blanket woven from the very fabric of the ocean. The Chum bucket, usually so empty, seemed to breathe with him, its silence no longer hollow but full. He inhaled, exhaled, and the building seemed to exhale with him, like a companion easing him into rest. The last thought that flickered through his drowsy mind was not of conquest or rivalry. It wasn't even of belonging, though that dream had been sweet. It was something smaller, simpler, a wish that tomorrow, when the ocean woke again, it would carry him gently, the way it carried dreams through the night. And with that, Plankton drifted, not into plans or schemes, but into dreams soft, endless, and kind. The dream carried him gently, as though the tide itself had wrapped around his small body. Plankton floated through waters that were no longer dark, but bathed in soft colors, purples, blues, and pale golds that shimmered like painted light. It was not the real ocean, he knew, but something between the sea and the sky, a place born of both memory and imagination. Above him, glowing orbs hovered like lanterns. At first, he thought they were stars, but as he drifted closer, he saw they were bubbles. Each bubble contained a tiny scene, a jellyfish drifting lazily, a clam yawning, a seahorse rocking gently as though asleep. The bubbles rose slowly upward, and he realized they were dreams, the ocean's dreams, floating toward the surface. He watched them with awe, their quiet movements soothing, like the rhythm of a lullaby made visible. Plankton reached out with one tiny claw, brushing against a bubble as it passed. Inside, he saw a vision of himself, not the schemer, not the outcast, but simply a figure resting under a kelp tree. He was smiling, the kind of smile that came without effort. For a moment, he wondered if he had stumbled into his own dream, reflected back at him by the sea. But the bubble drifted upward, leaving him behind, and Plankton let it go without sadness. Dreams weren't meant to be held. They were meant to flow. The current carried him onward, past coral arches that shimmered with faint phosphorescence. The coral pulsed gently like a heartbeat, filling the dreamscape with life. As he drifted through, the sound of the ocean became clearer, not the crashing roar of waves, but a softer music. The shifting of water against sand, the distant hum of currents, the faint song of whales far above. Together they blended into something that wasn't quite music and wasn't quite silence, but something in between. It was the sound of the sea itself sleeping. Plankton closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. He felt his body growing lighter, as though he were shrinking even further, until he was no more than a single speck of light carried by the tide. And yet, despite his smallness, he didn't feel insignificant. Instead, he felt part of something endless, a drop within the ocean, a spark within the stars. The thought filled him with a peace he had never known while awake. Shapes began to form in the glow around him. He saw outlines of familiar figures, SpongeBob, Patrick, Sandy, even Squidward, but they weren't solid. They drifted like silhouettes made of starlight, their features soft and blurred. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence alone wrapped him in a sense of calm. They floated beside him as though they had always been there, companions in this drifting world. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if this was what true friendship felt like, not loud, not demanding, but steady. The kind of presence that required nothing but gave everything. Even in dream form, the thought made him smile. The figures drifted away slowly, carried by currents into the glowing horizon. But Plankton didn't feel abandoned. Instead, he felt as though they were guiding him forward, leading him deeper into rest. He followed without effort, his body carried like a leaf on water. Soon he came to a vast expanse where the ocean floor dropped away into endless blue. The water here shimmered like liquid crystal, and in the depths below, lights sparkled faintly, moving like constellations. He realized he was looking down at the reflection of the night sky, not the real one, but a dream's memory of it. Stars twinkled in patterns, forming shapes he had never seen before. Some resembled inventions, some resembled friends, and some were simply unknown, waiting to be named. Plankton stared in awe, his tiny heart swelling with a wonder that made him forget, for once, how small he was. In this place, size didn't matter. The stars belonged to him as much as to anyone else. The current slowed, cradling him in stillness. It was as if the ocean were tucking him in, drawing soft layers of water over him like blankets. He let out a long sigh, the last of his restlessness fading. Every thought, every plan, every longing loosened its grip, drifting away like sand in the tide. And then silence. Not the hollow silence of loneliness, but the deep, comforting quiet of a world at rest. The kind of silence that made sleep inevitable. Plankton drifted deeper, wrapped in it. The last thing he saw was the faint glow of a single star bubble rising above him, carrying a dream into the surface. He didn't know if it was his or someone else's. It didn't matter. What mattered was the peace it left behind as it floated away. The dream unfolded slower now, as though even time itself was drowsy. Each moment stretched into the next, like ripples, spreading across calm water. Plankton floated in this unhurried world, carried by a current that seemed to breathe with him. Inhale, exhale. The water expanded and settled, a rhythm so steady it might have been the ocean's heartbeat. Around him, the scenery softened. Details blurred, the coral faded into gentle outlines, the bubbles thinned into wisps of light. It was as if the dream were loosening its hold on shapes and edges, becoming pure feeling instead. Colors replaced objects, deep indigos, pale silvers, faint glimmers of gold. They drifted and swirled together like watercolors, spreading across paper, blending without boundaries. Plankton surrendered to this shift. He didn't need to name what he saw. He didn't need to understand. It was enough simply to float, to let the colors wrap around him, to let the rhythm of the sea carry him deeper. The current carried whispers now, faint and soothing. They weren't words, not exactly. More like the memory of voices. SpongeBob's cheerful tone softened into a hum. Patrick's laughter slowed into a warm rumble. Sandy's calm explanations melted into a gentle breeze. Even Squidward's sigh became part of the lull. They didn't speak to him, but they surrounded him, filling the silence with presence. It was as if the dream were reminding him, "You are not alone, even in quiet." Tiny sparks floated upward, shimmering like fireflies. Plankton reached out, but they slipped through his claw, dissolving into the water. He realized they weren't meant to be caught. They were drifting thoughts, fading gently the way waking worries fade at the edge of sleep. Each spark seemed to carry something away, a restless plan, an old frustration, a sharp memory. With every spark that drifted off, Plankton felt lighter. He let himself imagine that the ocean was gathering those sparks, storing them safely in these stars above. Nothing was lost. Nothing was wasted. Even his discarded thoughts had a place, glowing quietly in the universe. The water grew warmer, softer. It no longer felt like liquid at all, but like a blanket, wrapping him in comfort. He curled into it instinctively, his small body rocking gently with the tide. For a moment he thought of how small he truly was, how vast the sea stretched around him. But instead of fear, the thought brought peace. He was small, and yet he was held. The ocean had room for him, just as it had room for everything. The dream began to hum again, low and steady. The sound reminded him of Karen's circuits when she powered down, or the slow hum of jellyfish gliding by. It was constant, reassuring, like a hand resting lightly on his shoulder. He let it carry him further, deeper into stillness. Images flickered faintly, softer than before. A kelp forest swaying in perfect rhythm, the fronds moving as though they too were dreaming. A clam half buried in sand, opening slowly as if yawning. A school of fish drifting in perfect silence, their scales glimmering like starlight. The world was asleep, and he was part of it. Plankton's thoughts grew slower. Sentences unraveled into fragments, then into single words, then into nothing at all. He no longer needed to narrate the dream. It was enough to feel it. The current guided him gently, his mind loosening, his body sinking into calm. At last, the dream grew so soft that even the colors seemed to fade. What remained was not scenery, not sound, not shape, but pure rhythm. The rhythm of breath, of tide, of sleep. Inhale, exhale. The ocean breathed, and so did he. Together they drifted, and Plankton, carried like a speck of light in an endless sea, let go completely. No plans, no worries, no striving, only rest. The world of the dream slowed further, like a lantern's flame dwindling into a steady glow. Plankton floated at the very edge of wakefulness and rest, where thoughts were no longer sharp, but softened into drifting shapes. The tide around him rocked back and forth, each swell a cradle, each retreat a sigh. He thought of nothing now. Or perhaps he thought of everything, but only in whispers. Ideas that once weighed heavy on his mind, formulas, rivalries, plans dissolved into quiet currents. They no longer tugged at him. They simply flowed past, gentle as strands of seaweed in the tide. Above him, faint lights shimmered. Not stars, not bubbles, but something in between. They pulsed slowly like heartbeats, glowing whenever he exhaled, dimming whenever he inhaled. It was as though the dream itself had attuned to his breathing, matching him, holding him in rhythm. Plankton's body curled smaller, his antennae resting against his side. For so long, he had carried himself like a fighter, a schemer, a dreamer chasing what he could never quite reach. But here, in the softest waters, he was simply small. And being small didn't hurt anymore. It soothed him, because the ocean, vast as it was, cradled even its tiniest creatures. A thought flickered briefly, gentle as a candle's flame. What if I don't need to chase? What if being carried is enough? He didn't answer it. He didn't need to. The question itself melted into stillness, a lullaby of its own. The dream deepened again. He drifted through what felt like a field of sleeping jellyfish. Their bodies glowed faintly, pulsing with the slow rhythm of rest. They moved so gently that the water around them barely stirred. Plankton passed through them like a speck of dust, drifting through starlight, bathed in their glow. Each pulse of light lulled him further, like the gentle sway of a rocking chair. In the distance, he saw shapes rising, waves lifting, curving, folding. But they did not crash. They rose slowly, paused, and lowered again, as though the sea itself had surrendered to sleep. He matched their movement without trying, rising with each breath, falling with the next. Breath and wave and breath, one and the same. Time itself grew soft. There was no before, no after, only now. The dream had thinned into something lighter than water, lighter than air. It was the space between heartbeats, the pause between sighs. It was stillness, stretched endlessly. And within that stillness, Plankton felt himself dissolving into rest. Not disappearing, no, but blending, becoming part of the tide, part of the rhythm, part of the dream that stretched across the entire sea. He wasn't separate anymore. He was carried wholly and gently by something greater than himself. The final images of the dream were simple. A single star glowing faintly in the deep. A seashell resting in sand untouched. A current curling like a blanket. Nothing grand. Nothing loud. Just enough. Plankton's thoughts loosened completely. No words remained, no schemes, no longing. Only warmth. Only quiet. Only sleep. The ocean rocked him once more, then settled. He exhaled. The glow above dimmed, and the dream, like a tide, carried him fully into silence. He was asleep, truly asleep. And in that sleep, he found the peace he had been chasing all along.